Welcome to the mysterious casebook, where secrets hide in every corner. Tonight, Miss Marple, with her quiet brilliance, faces a vanished portrait, a clue that whispers of long-buried motives. Who in the manor knows more than they let on? Pour yourself something warm, draw the curtains close, and let the mystery begin. The morning sun poured lazily over the rolling lawns of Little Whimsy, gilding the dewy edges of each rose and hydrangea with a gentle golden hue. For weeks, the village had been abuzz with anticipation of Lady Abernathy's annual spring garden party, a spectacle as much of society as of flowers, where neighbors and acquaintances mingled beneath the carefully pruned yews, exchanging pleasantries and subtle rivalries alike. Miss Marple, who resided a short walk away at the quiet end of Elm Street, observed it all from her familiar perch beside the hedgerow, a cup of tea steaming in hand, eyes flickering over the guests with a calm but keen interest. It was, by all accounts, a perfect day. Children ran with small kites along the gravel paths, laughter ringing across the manicured lawns. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with that of roses and sweet peas, and in the distance, the village band played a cheerful march. Yet even in this seemingly idyllic scene, Miss Marple noted subtleties that might have escaped a less attentive eye. A fleeting look of disdain between Mrs. Harrington and the new vicar, a tremor in the hand of Mr. Pritchard as he lifted his teacup, and, curiously, the way young Eleanor Whitcomb lingered a little too long near the grand portrait of Lady Abernathy herself, a looming painting of oil and dignity that had hung in the drawing-room for nearly half a century. As the guests settled into their usual patterns, Mrs. Dalrymple discussing her horticultural successes with anyone who would listen, Mr. Hargrove puffing self-importantly on a cigar, and the vicar subtly adjusting his coat as though preparing for an unseen confrontation, an unexpected hush fell upon the crowd. The source of this sudden stillness was immediately apparent in the portrait. It had vanished. One moment it had hung there, the austere figure of Lady Abernathy staring with her usual imperious calm the next. The ornate frame swung emptily, revealing a bare patch of cream wallpaper. A collective gasp rippled through the party. Whispers sprang up like startled birds, each person projecting their own anxieties and suspicions in a flurry of conjecture. "Good heavens, it must have been stolen," cried Mrs. Dalrymple, clutching her lace fan with a dramatic flair, her eyes darting about for imagined shadows. "Who could possibly dare?" muttered Mr. Hargrove, frowning and tugging at his cravat as if the very act of the theft personally affronted him. Even the vicar, calm by nature, could not suppress the flicker of alarm. "Surely," he began cautiously, "there must be a reasonable explanation." "Perhaps reasonable," interrupted young Eleanor Whitcomb, her voice trembling. "It's simply gone. Just gone." Miss Marple, from her vantage point at the hedge, did not join the chorus of outrage. Instead, she sipped her tea and allowed her eyes to drift over the assembled guests with a measured patience. She observed their reactions not as a distant gossip, but as a naturalist might study the behavior of birds in an unfamiliar setting, noting the slight tightening of a jaw, the quickened glance, the subtle hesitation before speaking. These were the threads from which understanding could be drawn. Lady Abernathy herself, arriving late due to her usual preoccupation with the rose garden, appeared genuinely bewildered. Her eyes, sharp and imperious even in surprise, swept over the gathering, noting the fluttering distress among her guests. "What on earth," she began, her voice crisp, "is going on here?" "Your ladyship," stammered a flustered Mrs. Harrington, "the portrait, it has vanished." Lady Abernathy's brows are knitted. "Vanished, you say? Are you quite certain?" She approached the spot where the portrait should have hung, fingers lightly brushing the bare wall, a faint tremor betraying her composure. Miss Marple, finally stirring from her quiet observation, stepped forward, smoothing her skirt. "One can never be too certain until every detail is examined," she said softly. in that unassuming tone that often led others to underestimate her, even as her mind catalogued every nuance. "Might I take a closer look at the frame?" The room, or rather the clearing in the garden where the crowd had gathered, shifted slightly to allow her passage. Guests pressed forward, eager to offer opinions and theories, each more fanciful than the last. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were not on the guests, but on the frame itself, the way it hung askew in one corner, the faint scuff marks upon the parquet beneath, and the tiny fleck of paint on the corner of a nearby bench. Small details, to be sure, yet details that spoke volumes to a mind attuned to the subtleties of human behavior. As Lady Abernathy tried to rally her attendants, summoning explanations and reassurances, Miss Marple's gaze settled upon the assembly of villagers. Every gesture, every turn of the head, and every whispered conversation was noted in her mind, catalogued and cross-referenced with knowledge accumulated over decades of quiet observation in the village of St. Mary Mead. In the shadow of the missing portrait, alliances and animosities alike became visible, if one only knew how to read them. A murmur passed through the crowd as someone suggested the police should be summoned, and the notion was met with nods and murmurs of agreement. Yet Miss Marple, unassuming as ever, felt no immediate need for official intervention. She sensed that the answers were not to be found in uniformed officers or investigative procedure, but in the subtler domain of human nature, small betrayals, fleeting glances, and the unguarded moments when a guilty conscience slips in. The details others fail to see. And so, with the garden party now transformed into a scene of mild chaos, a faint tension settling over little whimsy like a premonition, Miss Marple took her place quietly among the guests. Her eyes, soft but alert, traced the expressions and postures of each individual, cataloguing not only who might benefit from the disappearance of the portrait, but who might be too clever or too careless to conceal their motives. By the time Lady Abernathy regained a semblance of composure, instructing her staff to search the premises and calm the guests, Miss Marple had already begun her quiet investigation, not with questions, not with accusations, but with observation, letting the subtle truths of human behavior reveal themselves in the ebb and flow of this disturbed garden gathering. Something, she reflected, was not as it seemed, and in that deceptively tranquil village, she sensed that the vanishing of a single portrait would prove to be the first act in a drama far more intricate and far more dangerous than anyone yet imagined. By the afternoon, the news of the vanishing portrait had spread far beyond Lady Abernathy's garden, carried from cottage to shop, from the vicarage to the post office, until nearly every corner of Little Whimsy hummed with curiosity and conjecture. The village, accustomed to the occasional minor scandal quarrel over hedges, an argument about boundary lines, or Mrs. Dalrymple's persistent complaints about her neighbor's azaleas, found itself suddenly gripped by a mystery of unusual gravity. Even the most mundane of routines now carried an undercurrent of speculation. Shopkeepers whispered behind counters, children peeked through hedges in wide-eyed wonder, and every passing stranger was greeted with cautious scrutiny, as if the culprit could be discovered simply by the turn of a street corner. Miss Marple, meanwhile, made her customary rounds on foot, not out of obligation but from habit, allowing her eyes and ears to absorb the undercurrents of village life. She began at the small bakery on Market Street, where the smell of fresh bread mingled oddly with tension. Mr. Jolliffe, the baker, was behind the counter, flour dusting his hair like a crown of innocence, though his hands trembled ever so slightly as he arranged loaves. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice unusually high-pitched. "I dare say you've heard the news." She inclined her head, smiling faintly. "I have. But news, you know, is often taller than the truth. Have you seen anything peculiar yourself?" The baker blinked, searching for an answer. "Peculiar? Well, I did see young Master Whitcomb loitering near the Abernathy garden before luncheon and seemed to be watching the servants rather closely. But I only mention it in passing, of course." From there, Miss Marple wandered to the post office, where Mrs. Crumpton, the postmistress, had gathered a small assembly of her most gossips-inclined patrons. Each spoke in overlapping whispers, their voices rising and falling like a restless tide. "It's outrageous, simply outrageous," Mrs. Crumpton exclaimed, wagging a finger at a sympathetic listener. "To think anyone could sneak a portrait right out from under Lady Abernathy's nose." A man in the back, wearing a threadbare coat and a wide-brimmed hat, muttered darkly, "If I were to wager, I'd say it's that new governess always sneaking about, looking at things she shouldn't." Others nodded, adding conjectures of their own. The visiting cousin from the city, the gardener who had been sacked the previous autumn, and, surprisingly, even the vicar, who had been observed leaving the church steps in rather hurried fashion that morning. Through it all, Miss Marple walked quietly, observing faces, listening to tones, noting gestures that betrayed a more honest self than the words being spoken. There was Mrs. Harrington, for example, who prattled on about the dishonour brought to the household while subtly avoiding eye contact with the vicar. Mr. Hargrove's habitual smugness seemed frayed, as though he feared being thought incompetent or too easily deceived. And Eleanor Whitcombe-Sweet, gentle Eleanor, could not seem to settle her gaze, flitting from one adult to another with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each peculiarity with quiet efficiency, filing them away for reflection. Even the village children, who generally concerned themselves with far more immediate matters such as the height of the maypole or the quality of the garden cakes, had taken a keen interest in the missing portrait. They speculated aloud in half-formed sentences and riddles. "Maybe it flew away," one boy exclaimed. "Or maybe the lady in the picture got tired of staring at us." Another, more practical, suggested, "Perhaps someone hid it to see what everyone would do." Miss Marple listened, smiling inwardly. Even the innocent musings of children could contain a germ of truth, if only one had the patience to interpret them. By late afternoon, the constable arrived from the nearby town, summoned by Lady Abernathy's concerned staff. Constable Weatherby, a solid, respectable man with an earnest expression, was clearly unused to matters of subtlety, preferring instead the immediacy of facts and declarations. "Right," he said briskly, scanning the garden. "We'll need statements from anyone who might have seen anything. Every guest, every servant. Let's not waste a moment." Lady Abernathy nodded, grateful for his formality, while the villagers exchanged glances that combined excitement with unease. To some, the promise of police intervention offered reassurance. To others, it merely intensified suspicion, as each wondered who might be interrogated first and whether secrets long kept would finally see the light. Throughout this flurry of human activity, Miss Marple maintained her understated observance. She noted, for instance, the subtle ways in which servants exchanged glances, twitch of an eyebrow here, a pause in conversation there suggesting knowledge beyond what they openly admitted. She also registered Lady Abernathy's own behavior, though she projected authority and composure, her habitual gestures adjusting a glove, tapping a finger on the arm of a chair, betrayed an underlying tension, an apprehension that someone had disturbed her carefully ordered household in ways far deeper than the disappearance of a mere portrait. Miss Marple paused for a moment beneath the ancient oak at the garden's edge, allowing the scene to unfold around her. The air was thick with speculation, yet through the chatter and whispered accusations, she discerned patterns who sought attention, who sought to avoid scrutiny, and who seemed most genuinely perplexed by events. Each detail, minor as it appeared, was a thread in the tapestry of motives, opportunities, and deceptions that wove through the village. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lawns, Miss Marple felt the faint thrill of anticipation. The village had awakened to a disruption, one that would reveal its own hidden tensions and secret histories. She knew that among the polite smiles, the fluttering fans, and the whispered conjectures, the truth lingered quiet, elusive, and waiting to be discerned by a mind both patient and perceptive. and though no one else yet understood the depth of the puzzle, Miss Marple already sensed that the missing portrait was only the beginning, a small but critical fragment of a mystery far richer and far more intricate than the village had yet imagined. By the following morning, little Whimsy had settled into a state of uneasy vigilance. The garden party, which in any ordinary year would have faded from memory with the scent of spring flowers, now seemed to linger like a shadow, drawing attention to every glance and gesture of the villagers. Miss Marple, however, began her day as she always did, quietly, methodically, moving from her little cottage toward the village center with the unhurried grace of someone in no particular hurry, yet with eyes that missed nothing. She carried her knitting basket more as a prop than necessity, a familiar disguise for her habit of keen observation. The first stop was the vicarage. Reverend Eldridge had invited her for tea, citing a desire for companionship in these troubling circumstances. He met her at the door, his coat slightly rumpled and his tie askew, a subtle sign that even he, ordinarily composed, felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon him. "Miss Marple," he said, ushering her in with evident relief, "it is a comfort to see a friendly face. Everyone is talking at once, and yet I feel no one truly sees anything. It is as if the village itself is holding its breath, waiting for some unseen hand to guide us." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Observing without rushing often reveals more than frantic searching, Reverend. Sometimes patience yields what force cannot. She followed him into the small drawing room, noting with quiet precision the placement of chairs, the way the light fell across the carpet, and the subtle arrangement of his desk papers. It was these small details, unnoticed by others, that spoke of temperament, concern, and perhaps even deception. Reverend Eldridge poured tea while Miss Marple surveyed the room. "I suppose you wish to hear every report, every theory?" he asked gently, sensing that her visit was more than casual courtesy. "I do not need reports, Reverend." "People's behaviors often speak louder than their words," she replied, her eyes drifting toward a sideboard where a silver photograph frame tilted slightly forward. It held a picture of the vicar and his late wife, the angle imperceptible to anyone else, but Miss Marple noted it nonetheless. Minor disturbances, she reflected, often held meaning greater than the apparent significance. The village, in its collective anxiety, revealed itself not through announcements or declarations, but through small, unguarded moments. From the vicarage, Miss Marple proceeded to the Abernathy estate once more, now quieter in the morning calm. She was greeted by Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, whose hands trembled slightly as she opened the door. "Miss Marple." "Scarcely knew where to begin," she said, glancing at the empty wall where the portrait had once hung. "The staff is frantic, and Lady Abernathy as well. She is quite herself, but you know how unsettling this is." Miss Marple nodded, allowing the housekeeper to guide her through the drawing room. Every chair, every table, every ornamental vase was placed with precision, yet here and there, subtle signs betrayed recent activity. A footprint in the carpet slightly darker than the rest, the edge of a cushion displaced, a faint smudge upon the corner of a mantelpiece. Miss Marple crouched momentarily to examine the floor, noting the direction of scuff marks, the subtle disturbances in the dust along the edge of the parquet. "Nothing decisive," she murmured to herself, but enough to suggest that the person who took the portrait knew the household well and moved with care, though perhaps not with skill. Her mind catalogued each minor irregularity, storing it for later reflection. In the quiet corners of the estate, patterns were emerging, though invisible to anyone who lacked her trained perception. As she walked through the garden, Miss Marple observed the lingering effects of the previous day's excitement. The roses were trampled slightly along one narrow path, a hedge partially crushed where someone had leaned against it in haste. Small details, seemingly trivial, yet to her they were letters in a hidden message. She paused near the sundial at the center of the lawn, noting the way the morning sun revealed a faint mark along its base, as though an object had been placed there in a hurry, then removed. Even such minutiae, she thought, might contain a clue overlooked by the village in its anxious chatter. Returning to the village proper, she took time to speak with several villagers in passing. Each conversation, carefully casual, offered her a glimpse into both personality and potential motive. Mrs. Dalrymple, for instance, was eager to provide her opinion on the theft, speaking volubly about propriety and honor, yet she avoided Miss Marple's gaze when asked about the behavior of other guests. Mr. Hargrove, who had attempted to maintain his composure during the garden party, now revealed a subtle nervousness, the twitch of a lip and a shifting stance betraying discomfort. Even Eleanor Whitcomb, whose demeanor suggested innocence, occasionally faltered, her eyes darting away when certain topics arose, revealing that perhaps she knew more than she admitted. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile as she sipped her tea at the small village cafe, where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the chatter of patrons. Observation, she mused, was a far more revealing tool than questioning alone. People, when left to their own devices, revealed truths by the smallest slips, a hesitation in speech, a glance that lingered too long, or a subtle change in posture when a topic of interest arose. Every human interaction offered insight, provided one was attentive enough to notice. By late afternoon, the initial excitement had begun to coalesce into a more measured discussion of possibilities. Villagers speculated on the nature of the theft, opportunistic crime, a prank, or a deeper vendetta. Miss Marple, however, understood that speculation often obscured the truth, for it was in the subtleties, the patterns of behavior, the inconsistencies in explanation, the unspoken rivalries that the true narrative lay hidden. Each person, she observed, added a piece to a complex puzzle, a puzzle that extended far beyond the absence of a single portrait and into the intricate web of relationships, resentments, and long-buried secrets that made Little Whimsy what it was. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets, Miss Marple paused at the edge of the market square. The village had shifted subtly in tone. The earlier curiosity had ripened into cautious intrigue. She allowed herself a moment to reflect, cataloguing the fragments of behavior, the subtle anomalies, the fleeting gestures that others had overlooked. The investigation, she realized, would not depend upon forceful interrogations or grand displays of logic, but upon the patient accumulation of knowledge and attentive study of human nature in its myriad forms. With the first phase of observation complete, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, knitting basket in hand, yet her mind remained alight with thoughts. She had witnessed the unfolding drama, catalogued patterns, and identified the peculiarities that others missed. The village, still unaware of the depth of the mystery, would continue to speculate and chatter. And in that space between rumor and reality, Miss Marple quietly prepared for the next stage of her investigation, knowing that the missing portrait was only the surface of a more intricate, more delicate puzzle waiting to be solved. By the morning following Miss Marple's rounds, the atmosphere in Little Whimsy had shifted from mere speculation to the careful naming of suspects. Villagers had begun, in earnest, to assign blame, and in doing so, laid bare not only their prejudices, but also the delicate tapestry of relationships woven through the community. Rumors, once whispered, now took shape in the form of pointed questions and furtive glances, as if the act of accusing someone lent a measure of control to those who otherwise felt helpless. Lady Abernathy, in her usual polished manner, held a small gathering in the drawing-room, ostensibly to reassure her household, but in truth to assert a semblance of order in the face of chaos. Her voice was calm, almost formal, yet her eyes betrayed an alertness sharpened by anxiety. "I must insist," she said, placing one gloved hand lightly on the edge of the mantel, "that everyone remain forthright. The portrait is missing, and until we understand how, it is of the utmost importance that all observations be shared honestly. Servants and guests alike inclined their heads, though some more reluctantly than others, and in the hush that followed, Miss Marple detected the subtle undercurrents of tension who avoided eye contact, who shuffled nervously, and who fidgeted with the hem of a sleeve or the edge of a tablecloth. The first individual to draw suspicion was, perhaps predictably, young Master Whitcomb. His earlier presence near the Abernathy garden had been noted by more than one witness, and the villagers, ever eager for a simple explanation, seized upon it. "I saw him lingering near the rose arbor," Mrs. Crumpton recounted at the gathering. "He looked far too interested in the servants' movements, if you ask me. No proper young gentleman would behave so." Eleanor Whitcomb flushed slightly, murmuring something about her brother's curiosity, yet Miss Marple observed a flicker of unease that suggested a deeper story. Curiosity, she knew, could be innocent, but the insistence of others that it was sinister revealed as much about their fears as it did about his actions. Not far behind him in the villagers' suspicions was Mr. Hargrove, the solicitor, whose recent disagreements with Lady Abernathy over estate matters had been discreetly noted. His composure, always somewhat stiff, now seemed rigidly defensive. Miss Marple, observing him from across the room, saw the tight set of his jaw, the slight tension in his shoulders, and the meticulous way he adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. None of these signs proved guilt, yet they spoke of a man highly conscious of how others perceived him, and of someone wary that even minor missteps could invite speculation. The new governess, Miss Langley, had also become a focus of attention. Her quiet manner, previously unremarkable, now drew scrutiny. Villagers, unfamiliar with her presence and the subtlety of her social position, interpreted her discretion as suspicious. Miss Marple listened as Mrs. Dalrymple commented, with what she believed to be incisive wit, "One cannot know what a stranger might be capable of when no one watches." A household so well ordered, perhaps she saw an opportunity. The governess maintained her calm, though a faint flicker of uncertainty crossed her eyes, and Miss Marple noted it without judgment. Every reaction, every hesitation, however small, could potentially reveal far more than the speaker intended. Meanwhile, the staff offered their own interpretations. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, was visibly distressed, claiming she had been entirely attentive during the garden party. Yet even in her explanations, Miss Marple detected subtle inconsistencies. A delay in describing a particular action, a half-formed recollection of a footstep, a misremembered sequence of events. These were not clear signs of guilt, certainly, but they were threads in the larger tapestry, threads that Miss Marple filed away for careful reflection. Constable Weatherby, eager to demonstrate competence in the eyes of both Lady Abernathy and the villagers, gravitated toward the most immediately obvious suspects. His method, reliant upon visible evidence and recent opportunity, led him to focus on the same names whispered by the villagers, young Master Whitcomb, Mr. Hargrove, and Miss Langley. Yet Miss Marple, observing his enthusiasm, understood the danger of rushing toward conclusions. People often framed evidence in accordance with their own expectations, and those predisposed to suspicion frequently saw only what they expected. To complicate matters further, minor disputes and grievances began to surface. A comment here, a remembered slight there, suggested that the portrait's disappearance might not be an isolated act, but rather connected to long-standing tensions. Miss Marple noticed the subtle ways in which these revelations were couched in politeness. Mrs. Harrington spoke of her disapproval of Lady Abernathy's handling of the estate, yet softened it with deferential phrasing. Mr. Hargrove spoke of procedural frustrations, yet his words were punctuated with careful politeness. Even Eleanor Whitcomb, in her effort to defend her brother, revealed tidbits of information that hinted at rivalries and ambitions buried beneath the village's serene exterior. Miss Marple herself took note of all these dynamics, speaking little, yet observing everything. She listened to the undercurrents in conversation, the way one guest nodded toward another with an expression that did not match their words, and the subtle reactions of individuals when questioned directly or indirectly about the missing portrait. Each tiny detail, from a delayed glance to a misplaced sigh, contributed to a larger understanding of motive, opportunity, and character. By the late afternoon, the pattern of suspicion had begun to crystallize into a kind of communal focus. The obvious suspects, as defined by the villagers and reinforced by the constable's attentiveness to apparent facts, were neatly aligned, young Master Whitcomb. For curiosity or mischief, Mr. Hargrove. For personal grievances, and Miss Langley, for her unfamiliarity and discreet demeanor. Yet Miss Marple remained unconvinced. She sensed there was more at play, a subtler web of intentions and secrets, and she knew that the apparent evidence, while compelling to those eager for resolution, was unlikely to reveal the true sequence of events. As she returned home at dusk, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to reflect on the early investigation. The first suspects had emerged naturally, each appearing plausible in the eyes of the villagers, yet each carrying the faintest signs of contradiction or incongruence in their behavior. The puzzle was beginning to take shape, but the full picture, she understood, would require patience, careful listening, and an understanding of human nature far deeper than outward appearances suggested. In Little Whimsy, as in any village, the truth often resided not in what was shouted or declared, but in the quiet, almost imperceptible actions of those who believed no one was truly watching. The morning air in Little Whimsy carried with it a crisp clarity, though beneath its freshness lingered the heavy tension of unspoken suspicions. Miss Marple, seated in her modest sitting room with a steaming cup of tea, reviewed the events of the previous day in her mind, noting not only what had been said aloud, but also the subtler cues, the gestures, the pauses, the faint expressions that had flickered and vanished before anyone else could fully grasp them. It was in these quiet moments, she mused, that truth often whispered its presence, hiding in plain sight, while the villagers' collective attention remained fixed upon the obvious. Miss Marple's first stop was the Abernathy estate, where she wished to observe the servants during their routine duties, hoping that their unguarded behavior might reveal something overlooked by those who sought immediate resolution. She moved unobtrusively through the kitchen and servants' hall, greeting familiar faces with polite warmth, all the while noticing the smallest of details, a crease in a uniform not yet straightened, a tray slightly out of place, a smudge of dust on a sideboard that should have been polished. Each of these minute observations she knew could be misleading or inconsequential, but together they formed a pattern, a rhythm that hinted at disruptions in the household that day. It was in the afternoon, however, that Miss Marple encountered the clue that would, in her quiet, deliberate fashion, begin to shift the focus of the investigation. She had wandered into the drawing-room under the pretense of admiring the arrangements of flowers for the garden party that had, a week earlier, brought together so many of the village's residents. Her gaze fell upon the empty space on the wall where the portrait had once hung, and she noted, almost absent-mindedly, the tiny hook left protruding from the plaster. On closer inspection, she saw a faint, almost imperceptible scratch above the hook, as though something had been tugged or caught when the portrait was removed. Such a trivial mark would escape all but the most attentive observer, and indeed most of the household had overlooked it entirely. Miss Marple considered the implications. The scratch suggested not a simple disappearance, as if the painting had been innocently misplaced, but rather a deliberate action, one that required care, but perhaps also haste. She traced the edge of the mantel with her fingertip, noting a minute smudge of chalk dust. It was barely visible, yet it spoke to her of a ladder or support having been adjusted against the wall recently, a detail unnoticed by the constable, who had inspected the room with the kind of cursory thoroughness typical of those unaccustomed to studying human behavior. To the untrained eye, these were trifles, but to Miss Marple, they were vital signposts pointing toward opportunity and intent. Her contemplations were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, who brought with her the customary air of propriety and slight distress. "I thought you might like to see this, Miss Marple," she said, handing over a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper. Inside, Miss Marple discovered a piece of paper, a fragment, really, barely larger than a postage stamp upon which was scribbled a portion of handwriting that seemed out of place among the formal notes kept by Lady Abernathy. The ink was faint, the letters hurried, almost impatient. It bore the words, "Meet at dusk, if all is clear," and then it trailed off. Miss Marple turned the paper over, but found no further clue, only a faint fingerprint that, in her experience, might reveal more if considered in the context of behavior rather than forensics. She noted the fragment with deliberate calm. The paper was easy to dismiss, particularly by those who sought a quick conclusion to the mystery. Yet Miss Marple understood that it indicated premeditation, a plan, however small, that had been partially revealed through carelessness or urgency. The message suggested a meeting, a moment when the person responsible believed themselves unobserved, and it fit neatly with the earlier observations of the hook and the scratch on the wall. Together, they formed a subtle narrative, one that the villagers, eager for a neat explanation, would not yet perceive. In the course of the afternoon, Miss Marple also revisited several villagers, ostensibly to collect further impressions of the garden party, but in truth to observe their mannerisms and responses when questioned in her unassuming style. Mrs. Harrington, for instance, volunteered additional recollections of the evening, describing how she had seen Mr. Hargrove glance toward the drawing-room at odd intervals, as if anticipating an event that none of the others understood. Similarly, Eleanor Whitcomb mentioned that her brother had seemed unusually insistent on assisting the servants with decorations, a remark framed as innocent helpfulness, but one that, in Miss Marple's assessment, revealed an unnatural attention to the arrangement of the space where the portrait had been displayed. As the day waned, Miss Marple returned to her own home, her mind weaving together these disparate threads. Each small observation of the scratch on the wall, the chalk dust on the mantel, the hastily written fragment of paper, the villager's seemingly minor disclosures formed a lattice of subtle hints pointing toward the truth. While the constable remained focused on those whose opportunity appeared obvious, Miss Marple was guided by subtler indicators, gestures, inconsistencies in behavior, and the minor deviations from habit that often revealed more than words ever could. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a lesson in patience and observation. The first suspects, though superficially plausible, were only part of the picture. Real understanding required attention to those details most likely to be overlooked. The small smudges, the casual slips of speech, the items left where they might inadvertently betray intent. The hidden clue was never the large dramatic evidence. It resided in the nuances of human conduct, and Miss Marple had, by this time, cultivated the patience and insight to recognize it where others would not. As twilight descended, she placed the fragment of paper carefully on her writing desk, making a note to consider it alongside the other signs she had observed. Somewhere within Little Whimsy, the threads of motive, opportunity, and secret intentions were converging. Miss Marple, serene in her routine, sensed that the next few days would be crucial, that the hidden clue she had discovered might yet reveal a path unseen by the eager eyes of the villagers. The game of observation had begun in earnest, and she, as always, would watch quietly, allowing the truth to emerge in its own time. By the following morning, Little Whimsy had settled into a tense rhythm, the sort of uneasy calm that often precedes the surfacing of long-held secrets. Miss Marple, ever unhurried, took her customary walk through the village, nodding and exchanging brief pleasantries with those she passed, all the while noting the slight stiffness in posture, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact, and the subtle hints of unease in conversations. The small-town social fabric, so seemingly ordinary, was woven with threads of hidden animosities and buried histories, and today, Those threads appeared taut with tension. Miss Marple's first visit was to the Whitcomb residence. Eleanor Whitcomb greeted her at the door with a polite yet strained smile. "I wondered if you might care for tea, Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice unusually hesitant. The detective accepted, and they moved into the drawing room where Eleanor's father, Mr. Whitcomb, sat behind a newspaper, pretending to be absorbed in its pages, but failing to hide the flickers of curiosity darting across his eyes. As tea was poured, Miss Marple's gaze wandered over the room, noting the small inconsistencies that only an experienced observer could register. The cushions were slightly askew, as if someone had sat abruptly. A book lay open on the table, but its spine was bent in a way that suggested it had been closed hastily. These were minute details, yet in Miss Marple's mind, they carried significant subtle indicators of the household's internal tensions. Eleanor, hesitant at first, gradually revealed more than she intended. She mentioned, almost casually, that her brother, Lionel, had been unusually protective of a package he had received the previous evening. The description was vague, but the moment the words left her lips, her eyes betrayed her unease. Miss Marple, with her characteristic patience, let the comment settle, making a mental note of it. Protective behavior, especially when paired with secrecy, often hinted at a personal stake, and in small villages, stakes rarely pertained to abstract matters. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Abernathy estate again. Lady Abernathy herself received her in the drawing-room, a figure of polished composure that masked barely concealed agitation. The conversation began with pleasantries about the village's recent garden festivities, but it inevitably drifted toward the vanished portrait. Lady Abernathy's voice carried an unusual sharpness as she recounted her discovery. "I cannot imagine why anyone would take it," she said, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "It had hung in the family for generations. There is no reason for it to disappear." Yet, as Miss Marple observed, the lady's tone contained subtle inflections, moments of hesitation, a slight tightness around the eyes, and the barely perceptible clench of her jaw. Signs that suggested a more complicated sentiment than mere surprise. The detective noticed the minor disarray in the room. A single vase, slightly off-center, a stray sheet of paper on the floor near the fireplace, and a faint trace of powdery dust where a footstep had disturbed the otherwise immaculate rug. While these details seemed negligible to the household, Miss Marple filed them away, understanding that a careful study of human habits and reactions could reveal far more than formal interviews or police scrutiny. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had begun visiting several other villages, ostensibly to maintain social appearances, but in truth to observe interactions and unearth the subtle frictions that often accompany long-standing relationships. She spent time with Mrs. Harrington, whose pride in her household's order was only matched by her keen eye for perceived slights. In that conversation, she casually mentioned that her niece had recently quarreled with the gardener, though she dismissed it as trivial. Miss Marple, however, was attuned to the way Mrs. Harrington's fingers trembled slightly as she recounted the incident, an involuntary signal of deeper concern than she admitted. Meanwhile, in her subtle perambulations, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Hargrove at the village post office. His usual confident demeanor was tempered with an unusual caution. He glanced over his shoulder as if to ensure he was unobserved. In speaking with the detective, he deflected questions with practiced politeness, yet there was a tautness in his responses that spoke of restrained anxiety. Observing his behavior, Miss Marple considered the psychological nuances, the ways in which guilt or even fear of exposure can manifest as rigid posturing, fleeting eye contact, or hesitations in speech. The afternoon yielded further insight when Miss Marple returned to the Abernathy estate and was joined unexpectedly by the housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, who, after serving tea, confided in a whisper. "I cannot say why, Miss Marple, but there are things not quite right among the household." she admitted. Her voice trembled slightly, a sign of both fear and loyalty. She went on to hint at long-standing tensions between the staff, emphasizing rivalries that, though subtle, had escalated in recent weeks. Miss Marple listened intently, noting that these seemingly minor disputes could serve as both motive and cover for actions that might otherwise seem inexplicable. As dusk approached, the detective returned home, reflecting on the day's encounters. Each visit, each conversation, had added layers to the growing tapestry of intrigue. Miss Marple considered the behaviors she had observed, the protective secrecy of Lionel Whitcomb, the controlled agitation of Lady Abernathy, the subtle anxieties of Mr. Hargrove, and the quiet revelations of Mrs. Pritchard. Together, they formed a web of interpersonal tension and concealed motives, suggesting that the disappearance of the portrait was far from a simple theft. Before retiring for the evening, Miss Marple arranged her notes and mental observations, understanding that confrontation was only just beginning. The villagers' secrets, their hidden grievances, and their nuanced interactions were pieces of a larger puzzle. Each small slip, every moment of revealed anxiety, was a thread that, when traced with care, could lead to the truth. It would be in the coming days, she knew, that these revelations might be tested and challenged, providing the subtle cues necessary to identify who among them had both the opportunity and the hidden motive to commit an act that had so unsettled the village. Patience, she reminded herself, was the key. The human heart, in its complexity, rarely fails to betray itself under the right circumstances. The following morning brought with it a peculiar chill that seemed to settle not only on the rooftops and hedgerows of Little Whimsey, but also upon the collective mood of its inhabitants. Miss Marple, as was her custom, began the day with quiet observation from the window of her sitting-room, noting the subtle movements of villagers as they went about errands or exchanged cautious greetings along the cobbled lanes. There was an undercurrent of tension, one that carried the weight of unspoken speculation. Yet what she discerned from the soft, measured patterns of human behavior suggested that yesterday's conversations had begun to unsettle more than just the casual observer they had, in some cases, unnerved even the most composed. The first sign of the day's disruption arrived in the form of an urgent message delivered by the local constable, a man who, despite his own best intentions, often approached situations with a degree of theatrical timidity. The note was brief, stating that an unexpected discovery had been made at the edge of the village green location that bore little significance beyond its role as a central thoroughfare. Curious, Miss Marple collected her coat and walked with measured pace toward the scene, her mind already piecing together the likely narratives that such an event might reveal. Upon reaching the green, she found a small crowd gathered, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Mr. Hargrove stood at the periphery, shifting from foot to foot as though anxious to escape the public scrutiny. Mrs. Harrington clutched her reticule with white-knuckled precision, whispering uneasily to anyone within earshot. And there, near the base of an old elm whose gnarled roots twisted through the soil like the fingers of some ancient sentinel, lay the object of attention, the ornate frame that had once held Lady Abernathy's portrait. It was empty, save for a single sheet of paper tucked carelessly into its corner, fluttering lightly in the morning breeze. Miss Marple bent slightly, examining the frame without attracting undue attention. The paper was a hastily scrawled note, its handwriting familiar in its agitation, reading only, "I warned you. Trust no one." It was unsigned, yet its impact was immediate. Whispers rippled through the crowd, speculative murmurs about blackmail, personal vendettas, or even a deeper, darker conspiracy within the village. To the average observer, the note might have seemed dramatic but vague to Miss Marple. It was an inflection point. Here was a deliberate message meant to intimidate, mislead, or provoke a reaction. An unmistakable signal that someone was manipulating events from behind a veil of secrecy. Her gaze swept across the gathering villagers, noting their expressions and gestures with clinical precision. Mr. Whitcomb's knuckles were pale as he gripped the frame, and his lips moved silently, forming words that none around him could hear. Eleanor Whitcomb's hands trembled slightly, though she did her best to maintain composure. Lady Abernathy herself had arrived, her hat askew in her haste, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and restrained fury. Miss Marple catalogued each reaction, for she understood that these involuntary motions often betrayed truths that conscious statements concealed. A few feet away, the local constable was attempting to restore order, though his voice carried an undertone of uncertainty. He had already begun questioning witnesses, seeking a simple answer, a culprit he could apprehend quickly. Yet Miss Marple, accustomed to the fallibility of immediate assumptions, knew that the resolution would not be found in hurried conjectures or visible panic. The truth, as ever, lay hidden in the interplay of human motives, the nuances of behavior, and the secrets people carried like a private burden. As she watched, a new figure entered the scene. Dr. Felix Montague, a recent arrival in Little Whimsy, known to some as a man of science and to others as a curious, occasionally intrusive presence. He approached the frame with deliberate care, inspecting the empty recess where the portrait once hung. "Fascinating," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, "that the frame has been so obviously handled, yet shows no sign of forced removal." He bent closer, tapping the wood lightly with a gloved finger, almost as though the intention was not to steal, but to be seen. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Here, indeed, was the subtlety she had anticipated. Someone was orchestrating the narrative, controlling the information that reached the villagers and daring them to misinterpret it. Miss Marple noted, too, the fragment of handwriting she had discovered the day prior. The paper tucked in the frame bore similarities, agitated script, hastily formed letters, but it was not identical. Someone wished to convey threat or urgency, but in doing so revealed their hand ever so slightly. Behavioral patterns, the detective mused, often leave traces no ink can obscure. The constable's questioning continued, yet the more he attempted to establish facts, the more the villagers' stories diverged. Mrs. Harrington insisted that she had observed a shadowy figure near the manor late in the previous evening. Mr. Hargrove claimed he had been at home, reading by the fire, and yet his eyes betrayed fleeting hesitation. The Whitcombs each offered different recollections of sounds and movements in the house, minor discrepancies that might seem inconsequential in isolation, but, when considered collectively, suggested deception, or at least concealment of critical truths. Miss Marple, meanwhile, refrained from comment, content to absorb the reactions, the involuntary gestures, and the inconsistencies. Her mind worked quietly, threading together hints of motive, opportunity, and personal inclination. The empty frame and the cryptic note had shifted the investigation from mere disappearance to a more intricate puzzle, one in which misdirection and subtle intimidation played roles as critical as opportunity or greed. In Little Whimsy, as she had learned, the appearance of innocence often concealed layers of complexity, layers that required patient unraveling. As the crowd began to dissipate under the constable's gentle urging, Miss Marple lingered. She knelt briefly by the frame, noting the faint smudge along its inner edge, perhaps a partial fingerprint or the remnants of a hurried adjustment. A small detail, almost invisible, yet telling in its simplicity. The person responsible had been careful, but not meticulous. They had left a breadcrumb of evidence, subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, yet sufficient to reveal to a keen observer the nature of their movements and, potentially, their identity. Walking back to her cottage as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. Another twist had emerged, one that complicated the straightforward assumptions held by the villagers and constable alike. There was now a psychological game afoot, a deliberate attempt to provoke fear, manipulate perception, and conceal intent. The detective understood that in the coming days such maneuvers would continue, and that the true test of observation would lie in discerning the patterns hidden within these orchestrated distractions. The puzzle was deepening, but Miss Marple, with her characteristic patience and subtle insight, sensed that the threads would eventually converge, revealing the hidden motives that had brought the portrait and the village into turmoil. The morning that followed the unsettling discovery of the empty frame, little Whimsy seemed draped in a pall of unease. Conversations were hushed, glances furtive, and the very air carried a subtle tension that left even the most resilient villagers uncertain of what might occur next. Miss Marple, however, moved through the village with her usual composure, offering a courteous nod here, a soft inquiry there, all the while observing with an unerring eye. She understood that the unfolding drama was as much a matter of human psychology as it was of the missing portrait. The true insight would emerge not from the absence of the painting, but from the reactions it provoked. By mid-morning, the detective had devised a subtle plan to engage the villagers, particularly those whose behavior had seemed most peculiar the previous day. It required patience, discretion, and a delicacy of approach that would not arouse suspicion. Miss Marple began with Eleanor Whitcomb, inviting her under the pretense of a shared interest in floral arrangements. They met at the small tea garden near the edge of the village, a place that afforded privacy while remaining visible enough to appear entirely innocuous. Over steaming cups of tea and the gentle hum of bees among the flowers, Miss Marple allowed her conversation to drift lightly from trivial matters to more pointed inquiries. "Eleanor," she began softly, "it is curious how a single absent object can create such commotion. The portrait, I mean. I cannot help but wonder how much people truly notice when they think no one is watching." Her voice was gentle, almost conversational, yet beneath the surface lay a subtle invitation to reveal inner truths. Eleanor's eyes flickered, betraying the slightest hesitation, though she smiled and murmured something about the unpredictability of human attention. Miss Marple noted the tremor in her hands as she stirred her tea, the slight tightening around her lips, a signal that some internal reaction had been triggered. Next, Miss Marple found her way to Mr. Hargrove, whose nervous pacing in the village square had caught her attention repeatedly. She approached him with the pretense of seeking advice about the local historical society, a topic that he was known to favor. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "you have always possessed a keen sense for details others overlook. Perhaps you could tell me how one might notice the subtle changes in a room, even when one believes it to be empty." The phrasing was indirect, a gentle probe rather than an accusation. Mr. Hargrove's response was immediate, but revealing he stumbled over his words, glancing first at the cobblestones, then toward the manor, and back again. He laughed nervously, yet Miss Marple recognized in his avoidance the faintest quiver of discomfort, the spark of recognition that often precedes disclosure. Meanwhile, Lady Abernathy, ever composed yet clearly unsettled by recent events, had confided to the village solicitor her fears that the situation could escalate. Miss Marple, aware of the lady's predilection for attention to propriety, sent an unassuming note requesting a brief visit to discuss the manor's collection. Upon her arrival, Lady Abernathy greeted her with measured courtesy, yet her eyes betrayed an undercurrent of apprehension. Miss Marple, ever discreet, asked a few carefully chosen questions about the arrangement of the manor's interior and the handling of her personal belongings. Lady Abernathy answered, each sentence layered with subtle omissions, yet the detective's practiced eye discerned the patterns of concealment. Something in the lady's recounting suggested awareness of a deliberate scheme to unsettle her, and, potentially, others in the village. In the afternoon, Miss Marple orchestrated an encounter that would allow her to observe the dynamics among several villagers simultaneously. She invited a small gathering at her own home under the guise of reviewing plans for the upcoming village fete. It was an innocuous enough occasion, yet it offered an invaluable opportunity, the convergence of the Whitcombs, Mr. Hargrove, Mrs. Harrington, and Dr. Montague in a controlled environment allowed her to watch micro-reactions, the subtle shifts in posture, eye contact, and speech that so often reveal hidden truths. Conversation flowed around mundane topics, flower arrangements, the weather, local news, but beneath the surface, Miss Marple observed the invisible currents of tension, envy, and fear. She posed questions with a light touch, framing them around matters of taste or opinion rather than the events of the portrait's disappearance. Yet, in doing so, she watched closely for signs of recognition or unease. When Mrs. Harrington commented on the elegance of the manor's furnishings, she allowed her gaze to linger just a moment too long on the empty space where the portrait had hung. Miss Marple noted the flicker of reaction, the almost imperceptible shift of the body. Similarly, when Dr. Montague remarked on the fragility of old frames, there was a subtle but telling tightening of his jaw, a small signal of something personally connected to the frame rather than the art it once held. By early evening, the detective had accumulated a rich tapestry of behavioral evidence. Each villager's response, though minor in isolation, contributed to an overall pattern that Miss Marple's mind could analyze. She understood, as she had learned through decades of quiet observation, that people reveal their secrets in fragments, a gesture, a fleeting glance, a carefully chosen phrase. It was a language of human nature, one that required patience, empathy, and meticulous attention to detail. The true culprit often spoke loudly through silence, through avoidance, and through the tiny inconsistencies that escape casual notice. As the last guest departed, Miss Marple lingered in the sitting room, reflecting on the day's intricate dance of observation and subtle manipulation. Her plan had been simple yet effective. Create a controlled environment in which the suspects themselves would reveal more than words alone could convey. The empty portrait frame, the cryptic note, and the carefully managed interactions had set the stage for the final revelations. Patience, she mused, would allow these patterns to converge, illuminating the path to the truth. The puzzle was far from complete, yet Miss Marple sensed that the decisive moment approached. In the quiet of her home, the detective allowed herself a brief smile, aware that the culmination of careful observation and gentle testing would soon expose the intricacies of human behavior that had driven the events of Little Whimsy to this point. The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting gentle patterns upon the well-worn carpet. Outside, the village stirred with its usual quiet rhythm, though a faint undercurrent of anxiety lingered in the air, a residue of the past day's disturbances. Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting basket at hand, allowed herself a few minutes of calm reflection, mentally reviewing the events that had led to this critical juncture. The portrait's disappearance, the whispered rumors, and the subtle behaviors of each villager were all threads in a delicate web threads that she now needed to tie together to reveal the figure who had manipulated the situation with such cunning. Miss Marple's mind first returned to the small details that had seemed trivial in isolation, the unusual tilt of Eleanor Whitcomb's head as she spoke of the manor's furnishings, the nervous glances Mr. Hargrove cast toward the manor, and Lady Abernathy's careful choice of words whenever the topic of inheritance arose. Each had, in its own way, signaled a layer of concealment, a hidden agenda that no casual observer could have discerned. And yet, when considered as a whole, these behaviors formed a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. It was not the grandeur of the manor, or the value of the portrait that had motivated the crime. It was a combination of long-held resentments, opportunistic impulses, and the human desire to protect one's own reputation at all costs. She rose quietly and moved toward the telephone, placing a call to Inspector Craddock. "Inspector," she began, her tone gentle yet infused with the certainty of her deductions, "I believe we can bring this matter to a close today. If you could meet me at the manor within the hour, I would like to discuss my conclusions." As she ended the call, she could already anticipate the mixture of relief and skepticism that would accompany her revelation. Craddock, practical and thorough though he was, had a respect for her insights born of many past investigations, yet he still approached each case with a healthy measure of doubt. Upon her arrival at the manor, Miss Marple was greeted by the familiar sight of villagers gathered in quiet anticipation. The air was thick with curious whispers, floated like wisps among the assembled group. Lady Abernathy, standing near the hearth, maintained her composure, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of anxiety. Eleanor Whitcomb and Mr. Hargrove exchanged discreet glances, aware that the culmination of Miss Marple's subtle tests was at hand. Miss Marple invited all present to sit, her calm demeanor commanding attention without demanding it. "We have spent several days considering the disappearance of the portrait," she began softly, "and I believe that, together, we can understand not only what occurred, but why." She allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room, giving each listener time to focus, to allow their minds to align with her words. "The first point to recognize," she continued, "is that the portrait itself, while valuable, was never the central issue. It was a catalyst, a device employed to divert attention and to provoke reactions. The true intent lay in the manipulation of perceptions. Each of you, in your own way, has been affected by carefully constructed appearances, by what others wished you to see rather than what was true." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, settling briefly on Eleanor. "Eleanor, you were the first whose behavior drew my attention. Your concern for the arrangement of the manor's interior seemed excessive, almost performative. It was not worry for the portrait itself, I realized, but for the narrative that would be perceived should the portrait vanish. You feared not the loss of the painting, but the potential exposure of certain truths that you wished to keep private." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, a faint gasp escaping as her composure faltered. Miss Marple did not pause, moving seamlessly to Mr. Hargrove. "And you, Mr. Hargrove, your knowledge of the manor's historical details is impeccable, yet your nervousness over seemingly minor points was telling. You are aware of certain arrangements, certain hidden correspondences that others in this room would find convenient to ignore. Your actions, though subtle, aimed to preserve a secret that you perhaps hoped none would discover." The inspector nodded, scribbling notes, yet Miss Marple's attention shifted once more. Lady Abernathy, she observed, had orchestrated her own facade of serenity with deliberate care. "Lady Abernathy," she said gently, "your careful words concealed more than they revealed. You understood that the absence of the portrait would incite speculation, and you used that expectation to guide the actions of others, yet even if you were not the orchestrator of the central deception, your concern was protective, not aggressive." All eyes then turned toward the last figure of note, Mrs. Harrington. Miss Marple's voice grew slightly firmer, though never harsh. "Mrs. Harrington, it was your hand that moved beyond observation into action. You alone had both motive and the opportunity to remove the portrait without raising immediate suspicion. The small details, the perfectly timed inquiries, and your subtle guidance of others' focus all served to conceal your involvement. You assumed that the cleverest among us would overlook the ordinary gestures, and, for a time, you were correct." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Mrs. Harrington's eyes widened, her hands trembling as she realized the net had tightened. Miss Marple's tone remained soft, almost tender as she continued. "The portrait's removal was intended to achieve several ends, to protect your personal interests, to influence Lady Abernathy's decisions, and to manipulate the perceptions of those in this village. Yet human nature has a remarkable way of revealing truth, even when masked by artifice. In observing each reaction, each minor deviation from natural behavior, the true story emerges." Mrs. Harrington lowered her gaze, the weight of Miss Marple's careful deduction settling fully upon her. "It was all so subtle," she whispered, almost to herself. I did not think anyone would notice." Miss Marple offered a small, understanding nod. Indeed, it was subtle, but subtlety is often discernible to those who truly observe. And now, with the sequence of events laid bare, the village may restore its equilibrium, though the lesson of vigilance will endure. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, gently taking Mrs. Harrington aside. "You will need to accompany me, of course," he said. Yet there was no anger in his voice, only the calm acknowledgement that the case, complex and fraught with human intricacies, had been solved by a combination of keen observation and moral discernment. As the villagers dispersed, Miss Marple remained in the sitting room for a few quiet moments, reflecting on the human tendencies that had been laid bare. People, she considered, are often unaware of how their gestures, their expressions, and their carefully managed words betray them. It is not force or fraud that uncovers truth, but patience, attentiveness, and an understanding of human nature. The missing portrait had served as a catalyst, but it was the human behavior surrounding it that revealed the real picture in the end. And so, with the village slowly returning to its usual rhythms, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile, content in the quiet knowledge that insight, when applied with care and discretion, illuminates even the most cunning of deceptions. The village of St. Mary's Well had returned to a semblance of its usual tranquility, though a certain quiet unease lingered in the corners of familiar streets. Shopkeepers resumed their polite nods to each passer-by, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted once more from Mrs. Tilling's bakery, a gentle reminder of everyday routines that had persisted despite the recent disruptions. Yet even in the midst of this apparent normality, there were undercurrents of whispered conversations, glances exchanged with caution, and the subtle awareness that nothing in the village would ever feel entirely the same. Miss Marple, as ever, moved through these familiar streets with an unobtrusive grace, noting details that most would overlook. The subtle stiffening of the vicar's posture as he greeted her, the slight hesitation in Mrs. Whitcomb's smile, and the newly guarded cheerfulness of Lady Abernathy. All these small behaviors offered insight into how deeply the recent events had affected the community. People, she reflected, seldom recognize the degree to which their actions ripple through their social circles, leaving impressions that endure long after the original cause has been resolved. Inside her cozy sitting room, Miss Marple took up her knitting once more, the rhythmic motion providing her a quiet meditation on the lessons the case had offered. The removal of the portrait, the tension that had gripped the manor, and the eventual revelation of Mrs. Harrington's involvement had demonstrated in stark detail how the intersection of human vanity, pride, and fear can culminate in actions that seem inexplicable at first glance. Yet when viewed collectively, through careful observation and understanding of character, the puzzle pieces aligned to form a coherent picture, one that revealed both culpability and the motivations that had driven it. The villagers themselves responded in varied ways to the outcome. Lady Abernathy, ever composed, took measured steps to restore social harmony, hosting small gatherings that gently reintegrated the community and reaffirmed her role as both hostess and moral anchor. Eleanor Whitcomb busied herself with the manor's furnishings, ensuring that the atmosphere remained inviting and unthreatening, perhaps in part as a way to counterbalance the tension she had inadvertently contributed to through her anxiety over appearances. Mr. Hargrove quietly resumed his research on the manor's history, though now with a more cautious approach, acutely aware that his attentiveness had been scrutinized more closely than he had realized. Children, unburdened by social intricacies, resumed their games in the village square, laughter spilling into the streets as if to remind all that life, though altered, continued unabated. The baker, Mrs. Tilling, reported an uptick in business, attributing it to villagers seeking normality through routine indulgences. Even the postman seemed to walk a little taller, perhaps unconsciously reassured that the mysteries of the manor had been laid to rest and that the ordinary rhythms of delivery could resume without interruption. Miss Marple paid particular attention to Mrs. Harrington, whose demeanor had shifted from apprehension to reflective quietude. The woman's acknowledgment of her misjudgment, tempered by Miss Marple's gentle guidance during the reveal, suggested a potential for redemption, or at the very least, a tempered understanding of the consequences of one's actions. Miss Marple noted that human nature, while predictable in its impulses, was equally capable of adaptation and subtle correction. A fact she always kept in mind when considering both the culpable and the innocent. In the days following the resolution, the manor itself seemed to breathe a quieter, more settled air. The missing portrait had been returned, not to its original place of prominence, but to a safer, more inconspicuous location, where it could be appreciated without becoming a focal point for intrigue. The arrangement served as both a practical solution and a symbolic acknowledgement that appearances, while important, are often subordinate to the deeper truths that lie beneath the surface of everyday life. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the village as a whole. She observed how quickly communal life had adapted, how resilient yet fragile social bonds could be, and how the unassuming nature of ordinary people often concealed depths of insight and complexity. The recent events, though disruptive, had illuminated aspects of human character that would otherwise have remained unnoticed, offering lessons in prudence, empathy, and the careful calibration of observation. In her quiet way, she appreciated the intricate dance of morality, behavior, and circumstance that had culminated in the unveiling of the truth. Even the local police, led by Inspector Craddock, expressed a measured satisfaction at the closure of the case. Though reliant on Miss Marple's keen perception rather than direct evidence, their acknowledgement of her role underscored a quiet respect for the subtleties of human behavior and the necessity of patience when unraveling complex social puzzles. The inspector, pragmatic and methodical, seemed to recognize that intellect and intuition, when combined with careful observation, could achieve resolutions that brute force or rigid procedure might never attain. As evening fell, the village streets grew calm once more. Windows glimmered with warm light, smoke from chimneys mingled with the cool night air, and the rhythmic sounds of domestic life resumed with reassuring constancy. Miss Marple, returning to her cottage, paused for a moment at her gate, allowing herself a small, contented smile. The puzzle had been resolved, the web of deception untangled, and yet the intricate fabric of human behavior remained as endlessly fascinating as ever. The portrait, though returned to its rightful place, was no longer merely an object of artistic admiration. It had become a testament to observation, discernment, and the delicate equilibrium between secrecy and revelation. With a final glance toward the quiet village, Miss Marple entered her home, drawing the door softly closed behind her. She settled into her familiar armchair, knitting in hand, and allowed herself to savor the quiet satisfaction of understanding the world just a little more deeply than most. Outside, St. Mary's Well embraced its nocturnal calm, untroubled by the knowledge that, somewhere among its residents, human nature continued to play out in subtle, endlessly revealing ways. And in the gentle stillness, Miss Marple considered that this observation, patience, and quiet insight remained her greatest instrument in unveiling the truths hidden in the ordinary lives of extraordinary people. The dawn mist clung lightly to the hedgerows of St. Mary's Well, softening the edges of the familiar cottages and manor houses as if the village itself were sighing in relief after the tension of recent days. Birds called from the garden trees with the unaffected cheerfulness that comes so naturally in rural England. Yet Miss Marple, observing from the window of her own modest sitting-room, could not help but notice the subtle shifts in posture, expression, and movement that bespoke the aftermath of a community unsettled by revelation. There was a certain restraint in the laughter of children playing by the village green, a measured courtesy in the greetings exchanged by neighbors, and an almost imperceptible caution in the manner of those who had been too closely involved with the events surrounding the missing portrait. Such is the village after a scandal outwardly calm, inwardly alert. Miss Marple sipped her morning tea, allowing herself a few quiet moments before her mind returned to the details she had catalogued over the course of the investigation. She reflected not merely on the portrait itself, nor the momentary panic caused by its disappearance, but on the intricate web of human behavior that had turned a seemingly small incident into a crisis that engaged the entire community. Pride, envy, fear, and a craving for recognition had combined to create a scenario that appeared chaotic to an outsider, yet with careful observation and a patient understanding of character, every action and reaction fell neatly into place. It was, she mused, the perfect example of the way human nature orchestrates its own dramas, often oblivious to the wider consequences. In her quiet contemplation, she recalled the many moments that had, to the untrained eye, seemed insignificant: the furtive glance of a servant as she passed in the hallway, the nervous clearing of a throat during afternoon tea, or the slightly too rapid explanation of a past event offered by a villager eager to demonstrate innocence. Each of these tiny gestures, when combined, revealed patterns that spoke more eloquently than the most elaborate evidence chart could convey. To Miss Marple, these were the true clues, the subtleties of human behavior that illuminate motive, opportunity, and character, and which allow the patient observer to disentangle the truth from the superficial chaos of appearances. The residents of the manor and the village had been deeply affected, even if most would not consciously admit it. Lady Abernathy, though composed and ever the hostess, had shown the slightest tremor of anxiety when discussing the portrait's return, an echo of her concern for propriety and social standing. Eleanor Whitcomb, who had previously been immersed in the domestic details of the manor, now displayed a more cautious vigilance, guarding against potential disruptions with a conscientiousness that was almost a self-imposed penance. Even the gardener, Mr. Benson, whose role had seemed peripheral, had unconsciously shifted his patterns of work, avoiding the immediate vicinity of the portrait's display for several days, an action that belied an internal acknowledgement of the tension he had witnessed but could not articulate. Miss Marple, reflecting on the resolution, recognized that the exposure of Mrs. Harrington's misjudgment had provided a lesson far beyond the theft and recovery of an artwork. It was a demonstration of how pride and fear, left unchecked, can steer individuals toward questionable decisions, while the careful application of insight and understanding of human nature can restore balance, prevent further harm, and ultimately allow the truth to surface without unnecessary confrontation. The manner in which the villagers had gradually returned to routine, with small gestures of reconciliation and subtle reassurances, revealed the resilience inherent in those who inhabit small communities. A resilience that, when combined with discernment and patience, ensures the continuity of social harmony. As the morning sun lifted the final threads of mist, Miss Marple resolved to take a brief walk to the village. She had long found that movement through familiar streets often clarified thoughts, and she had been eager to witness the interplay of ordinary life in the village she had quietly come to cherish. The cobbled streets, the hedge-lined paths, and the clusters of cottages all radiated a sense of continuity, a reminder that while individual events might flare with intensity, the larger rhythm of life maintained its steady pulse. Villagers exchanged polite greetings as she passed, their expressions slightly softened by the recent awareness that even in the midst of misjudgment and tension, resolution was attainable. She paused briefly outside the manor gates, observing Lady Abernathy overseeing the arrangement of flower beds with the precision and elegance that had always been her signature. Eleanor Whitcomb stood nearby, offering guidance with a careful but patient manner, and the gardener, Mr. Benson, followed at a measured pace, acknowledging his employer with a nod that suggested understanding, if not complete ease. It was a tableau of order restored, yet with the subtle traces of human complexity remaining reminders that life's harmony is often the product of negotiation, patience, and the occasional gentle intervention of those who perceive more than they reveal. Returning home, Miss Marple reflected upon the case in its entirety. The portrait, once merely a decorative object, had become a fulcrum around which hidden motives and suppressed tensions had pivoted. The resolution had relied not on forceful accusation or public shaming, but on the quiet application of knowledge, the careful observation of character, and the gentle guidance that allowed truth to emerge naturally. She appreciated, as always, the nuanced layers of human behavior, the ways in which people can both deceive and reveal themselves, often simultaneously, through gestures, speech, and avoidance. Understanding these patterns, she knew, was the key to comprehending the seemingly inexplicable. With the village settled and the manor restored to order, Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair, knitting once again, providing a soothing cadence for her thoughts. She considered the delicate equilibrium that governed St. Mary's Well, recognizing that it was neither fragile nor unchangeable, but dependent on vigilance, kindness, and an awareness of the subtle forces that shape social life. Every resident, from the most prominent landowner to the humblest servant, played a role in maintaining the fabric of the community, and each would continue to contribute, consciously or unconsciously, to the patterns that defined their shared existence. As she placed her knitting aside and gazed out the window, the afternoon light illuminating the familiar streets and hedgerows, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet, satisfied smile. The case of the vanishing portrait had tested her powers of observation, patience, and understanding, and the outcome reinforced her belief that human nature, though complex and occasionally confounding, reveals its truths to those who take the time to notice. The village of St. Mary's Well, once rattled by sudden uncertainty, had returned to its steady rhythm, enriched in some small measure by the clarity of understanding, the reconciliation of tensions, and the gentle acknowledgement that even the most ordinary lives are threaded with extraordinary subtleties. The village of St. Mary's Well had settled into a quiet routine once more, though the memory of the vanished portrait lingered in subtle ways, like a faint perfume that reminded those who noticed it that something unusual had recently transpired. Morning light streamed through the lace curtains of the parish hall, illuminating the polished floors where weekly gatherings continued with renewed conscientiousness, each participant attentive to the nuances of conversation and behavior that, for some, might have gone unnoticed in less eventful times. The villagers moved with a newfound delicacy, a sense of caution mingled with a gentle pride in having endured the disruption with grace, and Miss Marple, as she always did, observed from the comforting confines of her sitting-room, knitting needles poised and mind alert. It was in these quiet hours that she often reflected on the ripple effect of small events and the extraordinary consequences they could trigger in even the most seemingly placid communities. She considered how pride, secrecy, and fleeting misunderstandings had conspired to generate tension, how a single object, the long-disputed portrait, had served as a catalyst for revelations that exposed the very human layers beneath polite exteriors. The incident had illuminated the intricate web of relationships, loyalties, and rivalries that underpinned village life, revealing that the harmony of St. Mary's Well was maintained not only by courtesy and social expectation, but also by the vigilant attention of those willing to notice subtleties invisible to the hurried or inattentive eye. As she sat, tea cooling in a delicate cup beside her, Miss Marple thought of Lady Abernathy and the measure of dignity with which she had navigated the public discomfort surrounding the portrait. There had been moments, of course, when her composure had faltered, an imperceptible tightening of lips, a brief glance toward a nearby visitor, but each had been a testament to her awareness of public perception and her skill in preserving appearances. Even in the aftermath, she remained a figure whose grace and authority quietly influenced the rhythm of village life, reminding all who watched her that social harmony was as much a matter of gentle observation as it was of manners and etiquette. Eleanor Whitcomb, too, had adapted to the lessons of the incident, carrying herself with an added awareness that her every action might be under scrutiny, however slight. Her attentiveness now extended not only to the domestic management of the manor, but also to the undercurrents of sentiment among those who frequented its halls. She moved among the servants and guests alike with careful diplomacy, a subtle understanding that in small communities, where reputation is currency and gossip travels swiftly, even the most innocent gestures could be interpreted with significance far beyond their intention. Miss Marple, with her habitual quiet observation, could appreciate Eleanor's growth without need for acknowledgement, recognizing that character is often revealed most clearly through adaptation to circumstances. Outside, the gardener, Mr. Benson, tended the flower beds and hedgerows with meticulous care, his movements steady and measured. He had resumed his usual routine, yet there remained a slight restraint, a cautiousness born from witnessing events that had disturbed the normal order. It was evident to Miss Marple that the lessons of observation and human subtlety were not confined to her alone. Even those whose tasks seemed mundane had been touched by the ripple of insight, however unconsciously. Each person in St. Mary's Well carried a fragment of awareness, an understanding that life, while ordinary on the surface, held depths that required patience and attention to fully comprehend. The local baker, Mr. Collings, arrived early that morning, delivering warm loaves to a few remaining households whose inhabitants preferred their mornings slow and contemplative. As he set the bread on the kitchen counters, he paused to exchange pleasantries with a neighbor, his words light and friendly, yet his eyes betrayed a subtle acknowledgment of recent events. Miss Marple, watching from her window, noted how even such an ordinary interaction was shaded by the undercurrents of a village still attuned to human behavior, each resident carrying memories of anxiety, suspicion, and resolution as invisible yet indelible traces in their daily conduct. These small cues, almost imperceptible, provided the steady rhythm of continuity that ensured communal cohesion. She also pondered the nature of curiosity itself, how it had propelled her through the days of investigation with a combination of patience, reflection, and empathy. The subtle art of noticing, of listening to what was said and what remained unspoken, had led her to discern truths that were obscured by deception, distraction, or self-interest. Miss Marple knew that human nature, in its complexity, often revealed the genuine intentions of individuals through patterns too slight for the untrained observer, and she had relied upon this quiet science throughout the ordeal, guiding the outcome without intrusion or overt confrontation. By midday, the village had awakened fully to its restored rhythm. Children's laughter rang from the greens, echoing against the facades of cottages whose windows caught the sunlight in gleaming patches. Villagers paused briefly to greet one another, smiles exchanged with careful sincerity, gestures of goodwill that suggested reconciliation without the need for explicit words. Even the previously tense discussions about the manor and its affairs had softened, conversations resuming with a lighter tone, the human tendency to move forward asserting itself with gentle insistence. Miss Marple, in her habitual fashion, made a slow walk to the churchyard, her steps unhurried, her senses alert. The church, a stone edifice of enduring presence, offered her a moment to contemplate the passage of days, the resilience of tradition, and the enduring patterns that define community life. She reflected on how, in moments of uncertainty, human behavior tends to reveal its most revealing characteristics, whether through subtle hesitation, inadvertent gestures, or the carefully managed presentation of self. In every face, in every step, in the rhythm of the village, there were hints of understanding, acceptance, and cautious optimism. Lessons both practical and philosophical, demonstrating the intricate dance of social cohesion. Returning home, Miss Marple settled once more into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she resumed her work. She thought of the vanished portrait, now restored to its place of prominence, not merely as a decorative object, but as a focal point for reflection, an emblem of the small but meaningful disturbances that give life its texture. The village of St. Mary's Well had endured the ripple of human complexities, and in doing so had reaffirmed the subtle yet enduring principles that maintain social harmony, attentiveness, kindness, and the quiet discernment that perceives more than is said. In the ordinary routines, in the measured exchanges, and in the unspoken understanding among neighbors, she saw the enduring heartbeat of the village, a rhythm both delicate and unyielding, as resilient as the human spirit itself.